Welcome to the Netroots Nation panel on factory towns. Thank you to all of you who are streaming from outside of Pittsburgh, and thanks to those of you who are here in the audience. So I want to tell about sort of the origin and the foundation of this project, and then we're going to get into our panelists. So there's been a lot of talk in D.C., a lot of talk. Some might call it prognostication or palaver. I don't know what you call it, but way too much talk about working class voters from a lot of people who don't really know much about working class voters. It's sort of the nature of D.C. is the more you talk about something, the less you seem to know about it. After the 2020 election, I was working with some friends to do some voter analysis in some of the battleground states, and we ended up dividing the counties in those states into 6 different categories. And Ian, you can go ahead and throw up the chart here. These 6 different categories: one was big cities, big city counties. Second was big city suburbs, which are in the same metro area but have some different dynamics. Third category was the college towns, places like Champaign-Urbana in Illinois, or Iowa City and Ames in Iowa, places like that. And then we looked at the agricultural-based rural counties where their economy is based on agriculture, and as well as 2 different kinds of counties that we called factory town counties, which are counties that have a higher percentage than the national average who are manufacturing workers, and for whom that county has a higher percentage of manufacturing output. And what we discovered is, even over Obama's great turnout numbers in 2012, Democrats did great in terms of turnout in big cities. We increased our margins there by about 500,000. We did a great job of moving the suburbs toward Democrats, in part because they thought Trump was terrible. And we gained about 500,000 in those counties. We gained over 100,000 in the college town counties. So we were doing pretty well. We lost about 500,000 in the ag, more purely ag counties. But that wasn't a big surprise because voter turnout was higher in general. And so that was more a reflection, just the same percentage or similar percentage, but higher numbers. But where Democrats really took a beating compared to what we had done in the Obama years, and before that in the Clinton years, and even in John Kerry's election, where we really took a beating was what we called the factory town counties. And these medium-sized and smaller counties that have a lot of manufacturing, that have been most affected by deindustrialization, by bad trade deals, by the opioid crisis, by factory closings and pension loss. Those are the places where we took a real beating. And as you can see from the chart, what we lost compared to the Obama years in those 2 categories far outweighed what we gained in the categories that we gained. And so it's created a real problem for us in these states. This is Pennsylvania and the Midwest. We wanted to take a deep dive, really study the problem, partly by doing polling and focus groups, and Selinda's going to talk about those in a bit, partly by doing voter file analysis, census tract analysis. We wanted to look at the healthcare statistics, the suicide rate statistics, the opioid and other addiction statistics. So we did that kind of analysis. But then we also spent time talking with people like our other panelist, Art Reyes, and with folks in the union movement, steelworkers among them. But there's a lot of unions that really have skin in the game, who really have been affected by the deindustrialization and the trade deals. And so we wanted to talk to them about their organizing strategies. And we came out with a report about all of this. And we are using that to do more different kinds of organizing strategies, including digital organizing strategies, including community events where we're organizing events for people to come and reconnect with their neighbors. So we've got a whole program that we wanted to tell you about today. And I want to start with Art Reyes, who runs a great organization in Michigan called We the People. I think of Art as sort of the ultimate factory town organizer. He's from Flint, Michigan. He knows these towns. He understands what people have been going through. And he also knows that there are a lot of there are a lot of folks that you wouldn't expect. A lot of times when people think smaller towns, they think they're all white. They're not. Immigrants are moving into these counties in huge numbers. There's a lot of black folks who are still in these towns, whose families moved up from the South 2 generations ago and are still there. There's a lot of diversity in these communities, and we should not be writing them off as all white. Art has organized in some of the whitest counties in Michigan and some of the most diverse counties in Michigan. And he's just a terrific organizer and really thinks about economic issues and how to organize on them so impressively. So, Art, come on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the kind words. And really great to just be here with all of you today. Thanks to everybody who's joining us here in person and online. My name is Art Reyes. I grew up in Flint, Michigan. That's home. I use he and him. I lead an organization called We the People Michigan. And we do multiracial working class organizing across the state of Michigan, from the Upper Peninsula to Detroit and lots of places in between. I want to share a little bit first, just a little bit of my story, and then a little bit of our work, and very excited about the conversation today to be in with all of you. So first is me. So, I grew up in Flint at a time where Flint was really changing rapidly. My family came to Flint in the 1940s and 50s as migrant workers who came up from South Texas. In a lot of ways, it was because Flint was a beacon of hope for working class people at that time. We had just won historic union contracts at the end of the 1930s. The Flint sit-down strike was one of our kind of momentous victories in the American labor movement. And there was not a lot of extreme wealth in Flint, but in the 1950s, Flint was the highest per capita income city in the country. It is the poorest city in the United States today. For me, I was growing up during that swing. So I was born when my parents were in high school, and I remember the first wave of layoffs and then plant closures, and what that looked like for me was seeing a lot of my family and community lose work, lose stability that they had had for a couple of decades with solid union jobs, and really the community begin to spiral. A number of challenges that we were seeing emerge, and I think in a lot of ways for me, the political education that I got was really from being a union hall rat. I was always at my dad's UAW local. His local was UAW Local 651, which was unique for a UAW local because the retirees were mostly women. It used to be the old spark plug plant with small parts. My grandmother worked at that plant. And so I got schooled by a lot of elders about what was at stake. And I think one of the things that for me, reflecting back, always really sticks out is the clarity that they had about what it took for working class people to have dignity. Some of the ones who were have since passed, when they were young, were part of the Women's Emergency Brigade, which saw themselves as the militant vanguard of the labor movement during the Flint sit-down strike, who played a key role in a really momentous victory. And they were very, very clear that, and they would tell us often, right, the only reason you had anything, you had food on the table and roof over your head, was because working class people came together and demanded it, and exercised their agency and demanded it. So I think when I think about our work and what it looks like in a place like Michigan, rooting in the community and the history that I come from, both from my family and a lot of the elders that I learned from growing up, we had come quite a ways from that to an era of kind of extreme micro-targeting of swing states or target states or high tier 1 election states, where suddenly there were only particular communities that mattered in an election cycle. The way that the work happened, from my perspective as a young organizer, as I was seeing this, was that what was happening is our communities were getting relegated to bodies and numbers or data points in the voter file. not leaders or agents or human beings. And there were only particular places that mattered. There's a lot of places that didn't, but if you could win in a few of the suburban counties and drive up numbers in some of the cities, it was fine. So we stopped organizing in a lot of places, especially in places that are perennially important in national elections like Michigan. And for me, what that looked like as an organizer was that we were building sandcastles, cycle after cycle. And sometimes they were big and beautiful and expensive, but they weren't ours. They were driven by an agenda largely from the Beltway, and they were temporary. They were very easily washed away. They were not built on a foundation where we were fighting for our own agendas. They were built on someone else's agendas who saw us as critical in winning a national election. They were not rooted in our agency and what fights we had to be having in our communities. And so I left for a bit. I stepped away from the state. I went to go study and teach with a professor named Marshall Gans, who came out of the farm workers movement and took some years kind of doing pedagogy development and working on what it looked like and meant to build disciplined and thoughtful movement organizing infrastructure. I was working at the national level as the national training director for the Center for Popular Democracy. And I sat in my office in Boston on January 21st, 2016, when my friend Wani, who I'd grown up with, called me as she left the house of an undocumented family on the east side of the city of Flint. And she said, they just found out about the water crisis because President Obama declared a state of emergency this week. A family member in Guatemala heard it on international news and called them and said, what's up with the water in Flint? They tried to go to one of the official distribution centers that the state had set up, giving away bottled water, but they were requiring state ID. Undocumented people had their IDs revoked in 2008 in the state of Michigan, so they were denied water. The grocery store in their neighborhood had been raided by ICE 2 weeks prior, a week after, it would have been a week after Christmas. And so they were afraid to go to the grocery store to buy water. And as a young family, the mother was drinking the water and was breastfeeding an 11-month-old, and their child was sick, and it was just hitting them, and it was the water. And I sat in an office hundreds of miles away in Boston, listening to a friend of mine who had grown up with her voice shaking, describing what was happening to a family that was in the same neighborhood as the neighborhood that my family moved to in the 1940s and 50s, as this is a beacon of hope. 70 years later, and this was a family not looking for a union job like my family was, they were looking for clean water, and there weren't plausible ways to get it safely. So I ended up called my boss at the time and said, this can be okay or not, but I need to be home. I thought I was going home for a weekend. I ended up staying for 8 months. Whole different story on all of that, but we built a massive volunteer organizing apparatus with folks on the ground, organizers, activists, family members, folks that I'd grown up with. Ended up launching an organization that's led now by an incredible organizer named Nayyirah Sharif called Flint Rising. And one of the most important lessons for me coming out of that was a result of a crisis of power. That's what happens when we're not actually doing the work of organizing with working class people and contesting everywhere. The things that happen are, a community like Flint wasn't politically relevant, so it was very easy for it to be tossed aside. That's the ugliest part of what happens. Families and communities like mine poisoned because we're not actually focused on doing the work that we need to be doing, which is building power and agency in a democracy. We're not data points in the voter file. We're people capable of collective action. And I think for me, in the work that we were doing, part of the lesson of internalizing this as a crisis of power meant that we had to be doing legitimate multiracial working class organizing and contesting everywhere, not just in the places that were politically relevant to folks in the Beltway every 4 years. We had to be contesting everywhere because it was actually our families and our futures were the things that were at stake. And so in a lot of ways, the work is rooted in seeing some of the ugliest parts of what happens when we're not focused on that. When we think it's okay to treat folks as if they are bodies and numbers as opposed to human beings and leaders. So really excited to be on the panel. The research is really remarkable. I think has been really, really resonant with a lot of the things that we're seeing, and excited to share more of the lessons from Michigan. But that's a little bit of a glimpse of some of my story, how we've arrived at this, and a little snippet of the work that we do at We the People Michigan.
Thank you, Art.
Fantastic.
So I want to introduce Kim Miller, who is a top assistant to the president of the United Steelworkers, by telling a story about the president of the Steelworkers, you will, I'm sure, will appreciate this story. So Tom Conway is his name, wonderful guy. And Tom and I were on a panel talking about factory towns a while back with Senator Casey. Very thoughtful discussion, very good discussion. But Tom started his remarks saying, well, I read Mike's 82-page report, a lot of great data in there. I feel like I can summarize it pretty well for you all. And I've had this theory for a while. People are pissed. That was his summary. I think that was a good summary, frankly. But we also feel like we can use the organizing and messaging in here to start to move people back to progressive politics and candidates. I asked Kim to join us to talk about organizing in these factory towns that the labor movement is doing.
All right, thank you, Mike. It's what I love about our international president, Tom Conway. He always can take the biggest of issues and boil it down to the simplest of phrases, and we all get it, right? We all get it. So just by way of a little bit of introduction of our union, for those of you in the room who may not know, number one, we're headquartered here in Pittsburgh. So as a current Pittsburgher, I'd just like to say, welcome to town. If you got here on an airplane or a car, chances are good those tires or many of the components and the respective vehicle were made by a steel worker. You know, if you headed out to the bar, you know, one night while you were here, chances are good that if it's a domestic beer or a domestic wine, the bottle it was poured from was made by a steel worker. And if you have Captain Morgan's, that's made by our members in the Virgin Islands.
Wow.
The next day, if you woke up and you ended up getting yourself into some trouble, you might end up, especially if you're broke, you know, needing a public defender. Those are also steel workers here in Allegheny County. And if you're tired of that scene and want to try something different, many of the museums here, the libraries, even, you know, some of the universities, such as the University of Pittsburgh, where last year we won an organizing campaign for about 3,000 faculty members at the University of Pittsburgh. So I say all of that just to say that the steel workers, sometimes we think steel and you get an impression of us, but we're much broader than that. But at our heart, we are a manufacturing union. We still have thousands of steel workers here in the Mon Valley and elsewhere in the Pittsburgh region and throughout the country of people who do make steel. But I'll just start by saying, when I read the Factory Town report, it was just all these little light bulbs were going off, and mostly appreciation, because a lot of this is just the story of my union, right? The story of my union. We are 1.2 active and retired members across the U.S., Canada, and the Caribbean, but where our biggest density is in Ohio, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Indiana, Pennsylvania, you know, all of these towns that have lived and experienced exactly what's happened with trade. Go back 20 years, I was working on Capitol Hill, and I was working for a member of Congress who led on the fight for more fair trade policies. And, you know, at that time, I saw the steel workers everywhere during those fights, and I was like, I want to be part of that. I want to be part of that. So fortunately, the last 20 years, I've been able to use whatever skills I have to bring to the table at the steelworkers, and like I said, currently working for Tom. But the things, you know, I come from an area of the country, Jefferson County, Ohio, and I think it's sort of an interesting parallel to the things that we're talking about today. So heavy industrial town, you know, through the years, or not town, excuse me, county through the years. My respective little town is under 1,000 people, called Smithfield, Ohio. But, you know, by the time I came on the scene, a lot of the industry was starting to leave, you know, and it was sort of a 40-year decline, but it was the story of what's happened in so many of these towns when we passed trade agreements like the North America Free Trade Agreement, or, you know, give China permanent most favored nation status, PNTR, you know, without considering how that impact is going to be on workers, not just domestically, but globally. And, sort of like my union and then me personally had a front row seat for that. So as the jobs left my area, the elementary school that I went to is closed. The middle school that I went to is closed. The church that I went to growing up is closed. The grocery store that I shopped at is closed. Right? And I have a deep connection. This is home. This is where my parents are. This is where we camp. I'll be there tonight. But, seeing that story and seeing what deindustrialization means, seeing what that means to people. Because when you lose a manufacturing facility, that's not where it stops, right? It's the grocery store that depended on it. It's the other small mom and pop shops, the gas station in town. It's all of that kind of stuff too. And, maybe one manufacturing plant may support, a huge multiplier in the broader community. So, this is sort of, when I read the Factory Towns report, I was like, yep, exactly. That was the story. So within my union, we have so many members that are in these places, current and former members, retirees in these places. And, and they are getting redder. My Jefferson County example, in 2008, when Obama was campaigning, he came to Smithfield, Ohio. He came there, right? And guess what way Jefferson County voted that year? They voted for Obama. But fast forward to 2012, the county flipped, and then you fast forward to, with Trump, it was 2-1. So that striking change in terms of our sort of political fortunes, is really deeply illustrated there. So within our union, having all sorts of members and their families and everything live in these places where these winds of change are not helpful and where we've sort of seen all these impacts, we spend a lot of time, effort, energy organizing amongst our members, and absolutely in the realm of legislative issues and policy. So I'll give you 2 examples of things that we've been working on. In 2020, we started an initiative for the first time called Your Union, Your Voice. And what we did is set out to have a conversation with our members. So we did over 160 town hall meetings that year across the country. But where they were centralized is in a lot of these places, right? A lot of these factory town counties. So we're not talking, the suburbs, the big cities, though there were some in those places. But a lot of them were, just small towns, all across the country. And so we listened to our members and we heard what they said. And then we also surveyed them, not as a scientific of a survey as Selinda would do, but more as an organizing type survey to just, informally ask people what's on their minds. And so we got back so many of these issues that are brought up in factory towns. We care about affordable health care and prescription drugs. We care about retirement security, and those pensions that were lost. We want that stuff for ourselves. We want it for our families. We want it secure for our parents. And people, labor laws, right, that allow us to form unions and secure good contracts. These are the things that led to a better life, and our members know this, right? And then, and then right on the tails of that, it's always trade. Right, because they've lived the story and they know the global pressures that most of their facilities are under, just in the global economy. So we set out to do that, and it was immensely helpful for us because we shared a lot of information. And within the steelworkers, when we talk about issues, we start with our contracts, and we start with what people are experiencing at the bargaining table. So it's those same kind of issues that I just mentioned, where we all have common ground, whether you're a Democrat, or Republican, or independent within our membership. You care about a lot of the same stuff, right? And these conversations are about finding that common ground too. So, that definitely was a good stage-setting piece that we did, and we repeated it again this year. Again, had over 150 meetings. The largest were more than 400 people. The smallest were a handful. But, we did the same thing. And the nice thing, this year, we were able to go back and say, hey, on those core issues, here's where we've come in the last 2 years. So we could talk about the National Labor Relations Board with our members and show them the contrast under Trump versus under Biden. And it's night and day, right? We can talk to them about 120,000 of our members' pensions were saved because of a move that happened last year in Congress. That's huge, right? That's huge for your retirement security when people were looking at the prospect of extremely precarious future. So we talked about those things. We talked about the infrastructure bill. Our union did a massive campaign to talk about all the things that we do up and down the supply chain to contribute to infrastructure. So we were able to go back and talk about these wins and to talk about the progress that we've seen. And we have, we don't need to be explicit about who's in charge because people can connect the dots on their own. So anyways, those are a couple of examples, and I'll just say too that since the mid-90s, we've had a program within the steelworkers. It's a year-round program called Rapid Response. Same kind of philosophy, right? We start with issues, all of those same types of issues that we talked about in those town hall meetings. Excuse me. And then with Rapid Response, so we educate you on the issue, then we pull you in and get you involved, right? You want to have a say in retirement security for your future, protecting Social Security, expanding the right to negotiate over prescription drugs, all those things. All right, here's what we're going to do to take action. Here's the phone calls we're going to make. Here's the letters we're going to write. Here's the rally that we're going to attend. And then after the vote happens, then we tell people, here's how your representative voted, Are they voting in your favor on that issue that you cared enough about to take action, or did they not, right? And so it's all part of this education. And of course, we have the straight up political piece too, where we're out knocking on doors and stumping for our candidates that have earned our endorsement. But those are some of the pieces that we're doing in some of these areas to try to, make sure people can cut through the clutter, because a lot of these issues are not making the headlines for our members, but they're incredibly important in their lives and changing the trajectory of their lives.
Thank you very much, Kim. I often think of a story that I heard about Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and how the Union Hall there was like literally the center of town. It was like the center of social activity. There was a bowling alley. There was there was a bar. It was like a place where people went and talked politics and hung out. And we really need to try to get back to that sense of community in whatever form we can, and unions are so key to that. So thank you. Good news is, as Selinda is about to report to you, the folks in these towns love unions.
Yeah, they do.
It is like one of the very few institutions that they still like anymore, because they're disillusioned and cynical about just about all politics, all politicians, but they love unions. So Selinda Lake is our last panelist. Selinda has been partnering with me on this project from the beginning. She's done a baseline poll for us. She's done focus groups for us. We're talking now about a program where when we produce content, she's going to test it for us to see how it's working in these counties. And she's just one of the most brilliant strategists in democratic and progressive politics, and she's trusted by the progressive movement and Democratic insiders, so it's a great combination. And so, Selinda, take it away.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that very generous introduction. And Kim and Art, it is such an honor to be here with you. Very humbled by it, and very humbled to be with you all, because this data means nothing if it's not taken by people to you in organizing the way that Kim and Art have talked about it. I have to tell you that this data, it's a time when there's a lot of data that's not very good. This data is so much better than we imagined it to be originally when Mike came to us with this project. And I thought it was a very intriguing project, having lived in Michigan for 9 years, but I had no idea that it would be the secret sauce that it is, and the real opportunity that this represents. So it wouldn't be when I first started my business, somebody marketed against us by saying, she only gives you good news. And my first client said, have you ever been in a private briefing with her? Because that's not true. So I have to share the challenges with you first. But out of the challenges and out of the chaos come opportunity as well. So these are voters in the factory towns, and they split in their party identification. They lean slightly Democratic. They are very convinced, and one of the biggest challenges we face is social math. They totally believe that their friends, their families, and their neighbors are strong Trump supporters, strong Republicans, and the best they can do is to keep their heads down and not say anything, because they don't want to get into fights, they don't want to get into arguments, and that is particularly true with the women members of the factory towns. But they are very, very negative about elected officials in general, and it is bipartisan negativity. They believe that the Republicans, even though they lean slightly Democratic, they believe that Republicans are better on issues, and they particularly believe that Republicans are better on economic issues and have a real economic plan, where they perceive progressives and Democrats to be without an economic plan. They also view Democrats and progressives as weak, ineffective, and they perceived Republicans, whether they like them or not, as strong, effective. Now, not every perception of the Republicans is good here. They also think of them as solidly on the side of wealthy and elite. And by the way, one tip on language, it's much, much better to refer to corporations and people as wealthy corporations, not big corporations. Americans are not, and particularly these factory town workers, they're not against big. Big used to mean a lot of union jobs, a lot of good jobs. What they are against is the kind of very populist, greedy corporations and greedy practices that they believe have thoroughly taken over our economy. They are more enthusiastic. The Republicans within the factory towns are more enthusiastic than the Democrats. Now, that may have changed a little bit, and this data was all before the overturning of Roe. But in general, the Republicans were fired up and enthusiastic. The Democrats were demoralized and exhausted. They are also much more interested, and this was different than what we had expected. We started out and we tried a variety of different approaches, and one of the approaches we tried was to talk about the personal traits of our candidates, that they taught Sunday school, that they had parents who had owned small businesses, that they were owned farms or came from farms. It turns out the personal traits, and we've seen this in a lot of our candidate polling, far less important to them than results. The only personal traits, and your boss is really right, the only personal lives that people are interested in right now are their own. And the personal traits they were interested in are, what are you going to do for me and my family? And I'm desperately worried about not just my children, but my grandchildren as well, and the next generation. There were tons of opportunities. First of all, these we think about, and one of the things I love about polling, and one of the things I love about polling for progressive organizations, is that conventional wisdom is wrong about 95% of the time, plus or minus 5%. And Beltway wisdom is wrong about 100% of the time, plus or minus 5%. So everybody knows, and I loved, Art, that you use this, that we're losing the factory towns because of the cultural wars. And there are some cultural wedge issues for sure. We're not losing the factory towns because of the cultural wars. We tested that. We're losing the factory towns because of the economic wars, because Democrats in particular are not perceived to have an economic plan that is on the side of real people. People are very focused on rising cost of living, economic issues, healthcare costs. Huge focus on rising healthcare costs. And this is the issue where women elected officials are perceived to be better than men, and where Democrats are perceived to be better than Republicans. We should be running hard on rising healthcare costs. We should be running hard on the prescription drug prices. People are really, really affected by this and really, really outraged by it. One of the things that was really sobering in this data was the hard living of people in these small towns, in these factory towns. They had unbelievable rates of chronic health conditions, disability, job loss, pension loss. They have been through really hard times. And those hard times have taken big tolls on their lives. And they are looking for people that get that are in touch with that, and that don't debate whether prices are going up or not. As one people in the factory town said in one of our focus groups, we use the line, this is temporary inflation and transitory inflation, and God bless these voters. They go, there must have been a steelworker, sense of humor like their boss, said, well, am I going to get a transitionary raise to deal with my transitionary inflation? Because otherwise, I don't give a damn how long the inflation is living. My family's hurting now. They are very, very populist and populist economics. So, of course, one of the conventional wisdom is we got to get modern. We got to get global in our approach. We can't be populist. That's old economics. Well, a lot of these people like old economics, and populist economics is on their side. Their number one issue was jobs moving overseas. They're very, very pro moving manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. They are also very pro wealthy corporations paying their fair share or paying what they owe. And that language that Anat Shanker-Osorio developed, and some of you may have heard her workshop, many of you will hear her keynote tomorrow, tests even better than fair share. They believe that the 1% are rigging the rules in their favor, and they bought the politicians to follow through on rigging those rules. They are very, very pro-economics that works for little people, and besides working people, they are also very pro-small business. If anything, we do not on our side include enough the small business folks with the working people. And we did some very interesting work for UAW, and we found that one of the union benefits that the UAW members wanted was loans to start their own part-time small business, get a couple of the guys together and be an auto mechanic or whatever. And they didn't see that as antithetical to the union at all. They saw that as one of the benefits that the union could provide. Two key values that are very, very important to these workers and the people and these families in factory towns are freedom and personal responsibility. Freedom is the number one value in America right now. It is the number one word that the right uses more than the left. We are for freedoms, and I think now with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and some of these other decisions, we are becoming clear that we are the people fighting for people's freedoms, and that plural tests even better than the singular, and that they are taking away people's freedoms, including the freedom to thrive economically, the freedom to raise your family with a good paying job and a pension and a benefit. Personal responsibility is also a value that we should be taking back. How can you have personal responsibility if you're not paid enough in your job to be able to have your family thrive and to be able to make ends meet? That is personal responsibility. So we can contest these values aggressively. We also need to communicate with these folks differently. They are watching local TV a lot more than they are watching cable news. They are hungry for community. They are very, very favorable to labor unions. And even if they think unions have lost some of their power, they think of them as a definitive source on economic issues. We also read a statement in the focus groups from a national labor leader, and we presented it as a national leader, not a local leader. These folks are very locally oriented, as Art and Kim have both discussed, but they loved the statement. They liked labor leaders, they like labor unions, and they trust them on economics. They think they're on the side of working people, even if some of their power has diminished. One of the things they hate is they hate corporate CEOs. They think the CEOs are even worse than the corporations. And one little tip about from now on, we should never call Fox News Fox News. We should call it corporate media. They hate corporate media. Even though they're not completely clear what corporate media is, they know they hate it. And so Fox is corporate media. And we should do the great reveal here, because I come from Montana, and across the board, all of our local newspapers, et cetera, are being bought up by corporate media. New Mexico, the number one local paper, just bought up by corporate media. We should be hitting this much, much harder. What are our opportunities? We need to develop a populist economic message and agenda. We need to lean into it. We need to be specific. People want to know exactly what we're going to do. We need to contrast with the Republicans. We need to set up the choice. The votes are there. The kind of voting records that the steelworkers are putting out, the kind of information of the update on the voting record, very, very popular with these voters. They feel that it's very hard to get information, and they like citations. They like check the facts websites. They like groups saying, here's the information, but don't just rely on us. Check the facts, go to the website, and see the information. We need to get on local media, and frankly, local media is insatiable. Channel 7 News is heavily, heavily watched. Even when we're buying ads, and I say this as someone who grew up on the farm, what do we listen to? We listen to the Ag Network News, and we watch the weather station. That's the most important news if you're a farm family. We need to buy our ads on the weather station. I want to give a shout out to Will Robinson, who is a big supporter of factory towns and one of the #1 experts here on how to communicate in conversations, and I hope he'll share some of his findings. And finally, we need to start local. I loved your metaphor, Art, of the sandcastles. That is just so poetic on so many levels. We need to have a local presence. We need to fight the isolation that these folks are feeling. We need to prove to them that, no, they're wrong, you're right, and that there are other people who feel the same way as you do. We also, as a last point, 2/3 of these available factory town workers, and I loved your spark plant story, Art, are women. We need to tell these women they need to vote differently than their husbands. It's a private polling booth for a reason, and you have your own way of thinking about things. So vote your own way, your own future for your own family. So let me turn it back to Mike, and really eager to exchange ideas and think about all of this together.
So before we open it up fully to Q&A, I did want to recognize Will Robinson, sitting back there. Will, I think someone's got a microphone that they're going to be circulating. Do you want to say a couple words? Because you've been doing some great thinking about social media organizing and communicating in these kinds of places, these kinds of counties. So, Will, why don't you spend a minute and tell us?
So, mic on? Yeah.
Yep.
So, I think what's interesting, building on what Selinda said, is that people really are in a news desert in some ways and are misinformed, which means they're getting their information from others, and we can't necessarily buy our way into that conversation. We need to start getting foothold in the community so people can find out information from people they trust. I always said the biggest problem we have as progressives is our campaigns are run by former high school debaters, no offense out there, who think communication is about winning an argument, and it's not. Communication is about building trust. And I think this is putting a foothold back in these factory towns and reconnecting with the communities so we can have communication by osmosis. And that's why I'm so excited about this project.
So do we have, people have questions or comments that they want to make? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a super quick question, well, probably for Selinda. Was it me?
Yeah, it's you.
Oh, thanks, okay. Super quick question, probably for you, Selinda. I'm thinking about the corporate media. Is it good to say corporate media like Fox and Sinclair, or do we not tag Fox and Sinclair? Because it feels to me like if they hate corporate media, then we should tie those together. No?
That's a really good idea. We have not tested that, but I think it's a great idea. Fox has, we don't need to worry about creating name recognition for them. They have full name recognition. But Sinclair is much less well known.
Right.
And we have tested that in Montana, and less than half of Montanans knew what Sinclair was. So we haven't tested it, but I like your idea.
Great, thanks.
The big worry about Sinclair, and there's a couple of other TV chains, who have bought up a lot of TV stations in local markets. The big worry is that, like Selinda said, people tend to trust local media and want to hear about local stories. And if right-wingers are the only ones buying up stations, like news stations, it'd be a very dangerous dynamic. There is a project now to try to get some investors to buy up, radio stations, TV stations in some of these markets. But I always tell people, every single person right now is their own media company. We can all share things on Facebook. We can all share things on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram. And we should be thinking about the fact that we can communicate messages to people. And there are some great local news services that people have just sort of developed out of their living room. And we ought to be encouraging those kinds of things as much as we can.
Can I just throw out one more thing? I want to plug the Rick Smith Show. If anybody has heard of the Rick Smith Show, he's actually out here talking to people right now. His tagline is, "Where working people come to talk," and it is fantastic. He's broadcasting out of Ohio, I think, and he's got a podcast, and I mean, just absolutely great stuff.
That's great.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Really quick question, and I apologize for coming in lately. Can you just give me like the top 4 or 5 places where these factories, towns were that you did a poll in, Ms. Lake?
I can give you some of the examples. I can't remember all of the counts. I mean, we actually did research in terms of voter file kinds of things, and some of the early voting analysis and economic analysis was in about 420 counties. But the sort of quintessential counties examples, Scranton, Pennsylvania, Allentown, Uniontown, Braddock actually is an example of a place that used to have a really thriving factory that shut down. In Ohio, you think about places like Youngstown, Marion, you can tell us Michigan, but Iowa, I always think about Ottumwa, which used to have a big meat packing plant, as well as a UAW John Deere plant, both of which have mostly closed down, most big downsize, some closures. But Ottumwa used to be the most Democratic county in the state of Iowa. When I was a labor organizer there in the 1980s, it was the more Democratic than Iowa City, more Democratic than any place. And it's gone for Trump twice in a row. So that's the kind of dynamic that's going on. We've got a question back there.
Hi all, Philip Zipman, he, him. I'm the founder of Creative Change, which is a network of digital marketers. And I really want to ask you as a follow-up, you mentioned kind of like a labor leaders as being one of those kind of groups of people that people trust. And I was wondering if you would have other examples of sort of spokespeople, right, that we as a movement can sort of reference as, in our ads, in our messaging as, really trusted institutions, things like, where the messaging would be welcome in the way that, politicians or like the party isn't necessarily, or certainly PACs isn't necessarily that place. Just to give you an example, I just did an interesting campaign in the spring around COVID and, folks who are resistant to COVID vaccination. And, for instance, religious leaders were kind of a powerful messenger in that story. I was wondering if you would have just, thinking around, what really helps break through to people in terms of who they listen to. Thank you.
I'll let Selinda talk for a second, but and Art and Kim might have something to add here too. Institutionally, the only two institutions where Selinda and I were really struck in terms of who people respected were small business owners and the small business community in general, and unions. And beyond that, they were cynical about just about everybody. These folks have been through a lot. There have been people who've let them down that they used to trust. And so there's a lot of cynicism. But I think individuals, I think people who've been in the military are often respected. I think ministers, as you say, are often respected. I think there's a variety of individual kinds of folks with credibility. Selinda, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would, and Will, you should jump in here too. I would volunteer 2 other categories of people that are testing really well right now. Public servant leaders are testing very, very well. So what is that? That's a nurse, that's a teacher, that's a doctor, that's a firefighter. But it's also some unusual categories of people that we don't tend to, so like school bus drivers. A lot of people think school bus drivers are the first line of defense. They're the one that notices if my kid is down first, or my kid's in trouble, if my kid is sick or whatever. And there are, of course, acute shortages of school bus drivers right now. Ministers, faith leaders can be popular, but there's a lot of cynicism around faith leaders too. But Sunday school teachers, people think, well, Sunday school teachers, that's kind of a public service kind of leader. So there are some people that, emergency room docs. We work for Reyes, and I know many of you love him. If you haven't, please look him up. He's great. And he is an emergency room doc, and he saved 3 people's lives flying back from Washington, and 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. And so a lot of his friends give him a bad time and say, why'd you save the Republicans? And he goes, do you think in the emergency room we ask what party ideas? No, we ask, where does it hurt? So some people like that seem altruistic. I really want to underscore the small business. Farmers too, family farmers, 3rd-generation farmers, desperately trying to hold on. And the corporate buyout and the foreign ownership of farmland is a huge issue that reams these towns. And then I just want to go back to what Will said. Honestly, these people trust friends and family. And particularly the female end, 1/3 of them are relying on friends and family as their #1 news source. Now, here's the problem with that. We either need to get a new family or we need to break into those networks, because crazy Uncle Joe, who is such a Trumper, is dominating those friends and family networks. And the women in those networks in particular are just bowing out. I don't want conflict. I don't want to fight about this. I want to have a nice Thanksgiving. Women also really trust their kids. And one of the biggest forces, for example, in climate change is kids talking to their mothers about climate change. It's been one of the biggest changes in attitudes. So it's the personal, it's the local, it's the person you know, it's the person who has your back that are really the credible sources right now.
Art or Kim, you want to add anything?
I'll just say historically within the labor movement, whenever we talk about trusted messengers, the local leadership always is very high on that list. So your local union president, whoever that person might be, if they're delivering the message, the credibility is very high amongst the membership. So just add that.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is to build on Selinda's last point around it being local relationships and where people have existing relationships that become really important. I think especially in the kind of era of heightened disinformation, the antidote to disinformation isn't more or better information, it's trust, it's relationships. And that's actually what, for us, becomes really important, is not kind of finding the perfect kind of profile of the person who is going to be the spokesperson for all of it, but it's actually making sure that we're doing the work of building the relationships and organizing folks and communities to be able to, educate and have those conversations with others. There's not a substitute for it.
So I sometimes kid with people. There was like this hot new phrase that came into politics a few years ago. And that was, everybody was getting excited about the phrase relational organizing. And I've always thought of that as just organizing. In order to organize, you got to build relationships, you got to have relationships. and talking to the people that you already know is a great thing to do in organizing. So, other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Don Wolford from the Center for American Progress. I'm originally from Youngstown, Ohio, and I think, thank you. I think an important part of this conversation is talking about young people moving out of communities like Youngstown, and it kind of creates a self-perpetuating cycle where, we have a lack of jobs, and we have a lack of opportunity, and we have a trend toward right-wing politics. And so people in my generation move out of communities like Youngstown to go for bigger cities where there's more opportunity.
Yeah.
But the difficulty there is that creates, that limits the ability of people from my generation who could be effective organizers in these communities to help make that change. And admittedly, I'm one of them. I moved to DC last year, and I hope to go back to Youngstown at some point and be part of that change. But I'm wondering about all your thoughts on how we can stop that cycle, with the lack of opportunities in these communities, because only through progressive action and by creating these strong union jobs are we going to make it so that people in my generation, want to stay in these communities and build that sense of community back.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start by saying I think the whole economic opportunity thing is so critical to this conversation, and that part of the solution here has to be that progressive organizations, Democrats, offer these communities real chances to, to rebuild their local economies, that there are real opportunities for that they are helping the small business people who want to start small businesses, that they're helping bring new employment to the area, that all of these areas get universal broadband, even the poor neighborhoods. That all of those kinds of things I think are really important. Art, from your perspective, what do you think?
Look, I think it's a big question. I think it's an important one. There's a few different thoughts that I have, and I think for me, it's more of how we see this used in the kind of battles that we're seeing in a lot of places. I think one that is really important is it also means we need to be pretty aggressive on understanding what investment in that economic opportunity and then small businesses and things like that looks like. Because quite frankly, in a lot of these places, the folks who understand how to move particularly public dollars and resources are industry. It's often kind of the corporate infrastructure in those places that understands the levers to move to capture those. We're seeing this a ton with counties, particularly in the Upper Peninsula where we work, where it's local industry that's positioned to really be the ones who are weighing in on what investment happens with ARPA dollars. As opposed to having kind of robust pushes on we need to actually be making some of these investments kind of longer term and economic opportunity for working class people. That's one. I think two, the other thing that I would say, and this is kind of zooms out a little bit, particularly for the Midwest in the region, is when we look at a state like Michigan. Michigan's one of the most segregated places in the country, right? We're, as a whole, we're about, the state's over 70% white. Our largest city by far is the city of Detroit, which is 90+% people of color, about 80% black. And when we have kind of places like Detroit, Flint, where I grew up, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, Muskegon Heights, multi-generational economic devastation where a lot of folks have kind of moved. Younger people have moved out or stayed and not have a ton of opportunity that are majority black cities, almost entirely folks of color. But also rural parts of the state, places like the Upper Peninsula, which by some accounts has been in a recession since the mid-90s, that's seen incredible loss of population, particularly of young people. That creates a divide and conquer, that creates fertile ground for divide and conquer strategies that the right's been that's really attacked. They've used this a lot, this kind of the brain drain. I mean, I've seen it a lot in counties like that, particularly in places like the Upper Peninsula, where the line to tell communities in pain that the reason for their pain are other communities in pain takes advantage of this. So I've seen it a bunch where it's we know that you're in pain here. It's to places like the Upper Peninsula. We know that you're in pain here. We know that there's been a significant loss of any jobs and opportunity here. We know that if your kids move, they're never coming back. And if they're around, they're probably struggling to find work or maybe caught up in an addiction crisis. And the reason for that, this is what the right is doing and exploiting. The reason for that, it's not your fault. It's because the state doesn't give a shit about you. The state cares about Detroit. Money goes to Detroit, and Detroit's a corrupt city that they use as a dog whistle. That's not about Detroit. That's saying black folks when they say Detroit. So they use this. They use the kind of structural segregation that we have to pit communities against one another, and we're not aggressive on it with a counter argument. And we're certainly not explicit enough, particularly the Democrats, on race when it comes to some of these conversations and what it means to counter that. So it's a little bit of a different take on the question that you're asking, but the way that I've seen that used is like that's used to organize people, to drum up kind of populist anger. It's just used for a right populism in a lot of these cases, and we actually have to be really intentional with what that looks like. And the last thing I'd say is like, I'm glad you're thinking about moving back. Like that is like, it's, you know, in a lot of these places, like we gotta fight for home. We gotta fight for home.
Kim, any thoughts?
Not as eloquent as Art. You know, I think one thing that sort of comes to mind is we have to stop the bleeding too. You know, we have to make sure that we're fighting for what's still there, because a lot of times what we've seen, you know, within my union is we have to fight constantly. You know, we have to bring trade cases when companies say, you know, they don't want to do it. We have to, as the union, initiate things to try and keep jobs here who are, you know, jobs that are susceptible to unfair trade. You know, and it's a lot of money, it's a lot of time. You have to show a lot of injury before you get any outcomes and stability in the process, and injury is usually a closed facility or job losses. So I think we need to guard against things like that, and you know, and there's other policies too, like Buy America. You know, this is a big thing for our union with the infrastructure bill. If we're putting a boatload of U.S. taxpayer dollars into stuff, let's make sure that still comes back to our communities and benefits, right? You know, all up and down the supply chain. So I guess I would just offer those two additional things, but I really appreciate what Art said.
I just want to underscore, well, two things. One, the Buy American, by the way, is wildly, wildly popular. And people think if you're spending private dollars, there's nothing you can say about it. But if you're spending my dollars, taxpayer dollars, yeah, Buy American. It's a wildly popular policy. And we're getting intimidated out of these policies that are very, very, very popular because they're not, I don't know, elitist enough or something. The second thing I appreciate about what Art and Kim both said is among young people, 2/3 are non-college educated. We have to make sure, and now we hear in focus groups, well, that's a great policy, but that's a policy for college educated folks. Where's a policy for my kids with a community college degree, or maybe a couple years of college, or maybe a skill training, or a chef's license, or whatever. So we need to be much, much more explicit that we are the whole spectrum here. We're not just forgiving college loans or canceling college loans, forgiving a bad word, by the way, because it sounds like it's their fault. But we are allowing student aid for people who are getting any kind of skills training after high school, any kind of job training after high school. So I really appreciated that was implicit in both of what, and explicit in both of what you were saying.
Okay. Okay, we have time for one more question. I haven't called from anybody over here, so I'll call on you. Hey.
So I just wanted to respond to what you just said about debt cancellation, because lots of those students who have student debts didn't finish college.
Right.
So that people who went to community college also have student debt.
Yeah.
People who went to college and dropped out also have student debt. So that it's a false thing of, it's a false notion that, you know, cancellation of student debt is only for, you know, kids who have who went to college, finished college, and not those others that you just referred to, because those others also have a lot of student debt and are going bankrupt, not being able to pay for them, and you can't go bankrupt with student debt. They just, you know, keep on, the interest keeps flowing up. So I think it's really important, because I think some folks falsely think that it really is just for the elites.
Absolutely right. And we have to paint that picture just as you did.
All right, well, we need to, it's time to wrap up. I wanted to see if our panelists have any final quick thoughts as we wrap up the panel. Selinda? Okay.
Good too. Just thanks for organizing. I think these are really valuable conversations that we need to keep having and keep lifting up.
Any of you that are interested in this topic, AmericanFamilyVoices.org. We have all the research, all the data, and as well as some analysis by me and Selinda and other folks. Art, you have any final?
No, yeah, thank you a lot. I think it's really important, and I guess just the last thing I would say is to emphasize from before that it's really important for folks who do this type of work. Like, we got to treat people like they're people, like they're leaders and agents and community members, and not just like they're data points in the voter file. Because it is pretty dehumanizing, and people actually get pretty pissed when they understand that like they're getting used. And they're not a part of shaping that agenda. And so it's really, really important for the long haul that we're moving away from the sandcastle building and actually building strong foundations.
Thanks, Art. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your interest. This is such an important topic, not just for electoral reasons, not just because it's the right thing to do. There's all kinds of reasons to care about these communities, all kinds of poverty in these communities, all kinds of struggle and pain. And as progressives, we need to be responsive to these communities. It's the morally right thing to do, and it also happens to be incredibly politically powerful and important. And as Selinda said, we came away from this work with far more hope than we did going in, and because of great organizers like the steelworkers and other unions, like groups like Arts, I think we can organize in these communities and bring them back to progressive values. Thank you all.